August 1352. The Sahara, between Sijil Masa and the Tahaza Salt Flats. 270 men, 112 camels, 1,040 miles of open desert. No rivers, no fixed shade, no permanent water source for 300 miles in any direction. The sand surface temperature, 54 C, that is 130 F. Metal harness fittings brand exposed skin on contact. The air is carrying less than 3% relative humidity, drier than the interior of a kiln at full fire. By every law of human physiology, every man in that column should be in systemic organ failure before the sun reaches its apex on day 3. But here's what actually happened. Modern medicine confirms what the body does at sustained ambient temperatures above 40 C. Core temperature begins rising within 20 minutes of unprotected exposure. The heart rate climbs toward 140 beats per minute as the cardiovascular system floods the skin with blood, desperate to shed heat through the surface. Cognitive function degrades at a core temperature of 39.5 C, and the critical failure is that judgment collapses before strength does. A man loses the ability to make correct decisions while he still feels physically capable of walking. That gap between mental failure and physical collapse is where people die. At 41 C core temperature, proteins inside living cells begin to denature. This is not metaphor. This is biochemistry. The enzymes that govern cellular respiration, the molecular machinery that keeps every organ in the body functioning, stop working. And unlike most physiological systems, they do not recover once the threshold is crossed. The U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine has documented this with clinical precision. An unprotected adult in direct Saharan sun, without water, without shelter, without the correct clothing architecture, reaches irreversible heat stroke in 4 to 7 hours. Not days, hours, 4 hours. And yet, the Rihla, the travel memoir of Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan jurist and explorer, written in 1355, documents the Tahaza caravan crossing in terms that read more like an engineering report than a travel diary. Ibn Battuta records a procession that moved exclusively between midnight and the pre-dawn hours, rested beneath purpose-built shade structures during the 10-hour peak heat window, and consumed water at intervals controlled by the caravan master's calculation, not by the thirst of individual men. He notes that the Bedouin guides leading the column had memorized not simply the route, but the physical behavior of every sector of desert along it, where the sand surface destabilizes underfoot at specific temperatures, where subsurface moisture concentrates beneath certain geological formations, where to excavate, and at what depth. This was not intuition. It was accumulated technical knowledge transmitted across generations with the fidelity of an engineering manual. Dr. Timothy Insall of the University of Manchester, analyzing trans-Saharan caravan logistics and mortality records in 2003, confirmed that survival rates on Bedouin-managed routes were structurally and repeatably higher than on routes managed by outside traders, not because of luck, not because of hardiness, but because of consistent, transferable, teachable systems that functioned every time they were correctly deployed. Here is what that means physically. The Beit al-Shahar, the House of Hair, was not a tent. Every word in that translation is wrong. A tent is a temporary structure that provides minimal protection. The Beit al-Shahar was a precision passive cooling engine. It happened to be made from woven fiber rather than steel and glass, but its operating principles are the same principles that govern every modern air handling system built since. The fabric was woven from black goat hair. Individual panels measured 4 to 5 meters in width, stitched side by side to cover a ground footprint of 9 to 12 meters in length and 4 to 5 meters in depth. The weave count was approximately 20 threads per centimeter, intentionally coarser than what a weaver would produce if the goal were warmth or rain resistance. The gaps were not a defect. The gaps were the engineering. Here is what happens physically. The sun strikes the outer surface of that black fabric at full Saharan intensity, approximately 900 watts of solar radiation per square meter at peak hour. The outer face of the tent absorbs that radiation and heats rapidly, reaching surface temperatures of 65 to 70 C. But heat does not conduct uniformly through a loosely woven fiber. The inner face of the fabric, 3 centimeters away, stays in the low 30s. That differential drives the mechanism. Hot air at the outer surface rises. It evacuates upward through the microgaps in the weave, pulling cooler air in at the base, where the tent sides are raised 6 to 12 inches off the ground. The entire structure functions as a continuous passive chimney. Picture every gap in that fabric as a tiny exhaust port. There are tens of thousands of them. Every second, the structure is flushing hot air out and drawing cooler air through the living space below, with no mechanical assistance, no electricity, no moving parts. This is natural convective ventilation, and the choice of black fabric over white white or undyed material is not incidental. It is the design decision that makes the system work. A lighter fabric would absorb less solar energy at the outer surface, reduce the temperature differential, and slow the convective airflow. The counterintuitive choice of black maximizes the driving force that keeps the interior cool. The same goat hair fiber carries a second engineered property. The coarse, medullated structure of the individual hairs swells when ambient humidity increases, sealing the weave at night to trap body heat inside. The same structure that vents heat during the day becomes an insulating barrier after sundown when desert temperatures drop to 15°C. One material, two opposite thermal functions. Automatic, no adjustment required. The University of Beni Suef published a thermodynamic study in 2013 measuring interior temperatures inside a correctly pitched Beit al-Shahar against ambient air during a Saharan summer. The result, 15°C of interior cooling relative to the outside air, sustained across the full peak heat window. A second measurement confirmed that no modern tent fabric produced by synthetic textile manufacturing achieves greater than 8°C of reduction under comparable solar conditions. A modern military-grade desert personnel shelter, the U.S. Army Modular General Purpose Tent System, current procurement cost approximately $2,800 per unit, achieves 6 to 9°C of interior cooling under comparable conditions. The Beit al-Shahar achieves 15°C, without electricity, without maintenance, without replacement parts. Here is what the researchers who first measured those numbers were not expecting. The tent's thermal performance is not its most important survival function. There is a second calculation embedded in the Beit al-Shahar that determines whether the men inside it live or die, and it has nothing to do with temperature. The second system left no archaeological trace, no ruins, no artifacts, no excavated structures. It survives only in the documentary record and in the physiological mathematics that any trained engineer can verify today. It was a water management architecture, and it was built not from any material, but from behavioral constraint. Bedouin caravans operating the Tagaza and Tanis roofed routes, the two most lethal long-distance desert crossings in the Saharan network, followed a movement protocol that violates every instinct modern endurance training produces. They did not push through difficult conditions. They did not march in heat. They moved in a precisely defined daily window, departure at 10 p.m., sustained travel through the coolest hours, halt no later than 7 a.m., and then complete, enforced stillness for the following 11 hours. Not rest. Stillness. No unnecessary movement. No exposure to direct sun. No tasks that raise metabolic rate above resting baseline. The physics is worth understanding precisely. A resting adult in a correctly pitched Beit al-Sha'ar, wearing full-length loose robes, produces approximately 0.35 liters of sweat per hour through passive perspiration. The same adult walking in direct Saharan sun at a standard march pace produces 1.5 liters of sweat per hour, a factor of more than 4. The difference across a single 11-hour rest period is 12.7 liters per person. Across a 270-man caravan, that difference is 3,429 liters every single day the protocol is correctly observed. That is not a marginal efficiency gain. That is the difference between a water supply that lasts 23 days and one that runs out on day 17, 300 miles short of the next reliable source. The caravan master, the Qa'id al-Kafila, did not manage the water by eye or by feel. Charles Doty, Travels in Arabia Deserta, 1888, documented the allocation system with the kind of detail that unsettled him precisely because it resembled an industrial logistics operation rather than a nomadic arrangement. The Qagid tracked total water volume remaining against days traveled, days remaining, current heat conditions, and individual consumption records. He issued daily rations. He knew, at any point on the crossing, whether the column was ahead of the water budget or behind it, and he adjusted movement pace and rest periods accordingly. Nobody drank when they were thirsty. Thirst, in severe heat, appears approximately 2 hours after the body has already entered a measurable dehydration state. The sensation lags the physiological reality by the exact margin that kills people. The Bedouin system decoupled drinking from thirst entirely. Consumption was scheduled. It was mathematical. It was not optional. The Smithsonian Institution's ethnographic records on Bedouin caravan culture, compiled through field surveys conducted across the Arabian Peninsula in the 1980s and 1990s, confirm that this water budgeting discipline was not informal custom. It was transmitted knowledge, passed from senior caravan masters to apprentices through a structured oral curriculum that included specific numerical thresholds for ration adjustment under different heat and wind conditions. This was not survival. It was supply chain management, executed without paper, without instruments, without any technology more complex than a sealed leather vessel, and a man who had memorized the arithmetic. The third system contradicts something that every modern survival resource states as foundational fact: And the contradiction is not subtle. Every survival manual produced in the last 50 years, military field manuals, wilderness medicine handbooks, emergency preparedness guides, contains a version of the same instruction for heat emergencies: remove clothing, expose skin, maximize the body's ability to radiate heat directly into the environment. The Bedouin system is the precise opposite, and the physiology explains why the manuals are wrong about the desert specifically, even if they are correct about other environments. The traditional Bedouin traveling robe, the thob in its long-distance caravan variant, cut loose and full-length in undyed cream or white wool or lightweight cotton, covered approximately 85% of total body surface area. Neck wrapped, wrists covered, head and face partially shielded. This was worn continuously during any daylight exposure in the open desert, at temperatures reaching 54°C, voluntarily and deliberately. The mechanism is counterintuitive, and it is physical. Direct solar radiation at the Saharan surface delivers approximately 600 watts of thermal energy per square meter onto anything it strikes. On bare skin, that energy converts directly to heat in the skin surface layers and drives core temperature upward. A light-colored loose robe intercepts that radiation before it reaches the skin. The outer fabric surface absorbs it, heats up, and radiates it back outward, or convects it away through the air gap between fabric and body. That air gap is the second mechanism. The loose cut of the robe maintains a consistent column of air, roughly 2 to 4 centimeters deep, between the fabric and the skin. Sweat produced by the body evaporates into this air column. Evaporation is the body's primary cooling mechanism. The conversion of liquid water to vapor pulls thermal energy directly from the skin surface at approximately 2,430 joules per gram of water evaporated. On bare skin and Saharan air with 3% relative humidity, that evaporation happens instantaneously. The sweat is gone before it has extracted meaningful heat from the skin. The cooling effect is minimal. The water loss is total. Inside the air gap of a loose robe, the local humidity is elevated by the sweat itself, slowing the evaporation rate slightly, extending the duration of contact between the evaporating liquid and the skin surface, and increasing the net heat extraction per gram of water lost. The body cools more efficiently using less water. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Experimental Biology, conducted by researchers at Tel Aviv University, measured this effect directly. Subjects in identical desert conditions were tested in bare skin exposure versus loose robes. The robed condition produced a lower mean skin temperature, a lower core body temperature at the 2-hour mark, a lower heart rate, and a 23% reduction in net water loss compared to bare skin under the same thermal load. 23%. The robe is not just more comfortable, it is more efficient by every physiological variable that determines survival duration in extreme heat. A modern military evaporative cooling vest, the current U.S. Army issue PSU cooling vest, procurement cost between $140 and $320 per unit, covers approximately 28% of body surface area. It requires active re-wetting with water every 90 minutes to maintain function. The Bedouin thob covers 85% of body surface area. It self-replenishes through normal perspiration. It requires no external water input, no maintenance cycle, no replacement components. It has been in continuous field refinement for at least 3,000 years. The math is exact. But before we continue, let's deal with what every film, every textbook illustration, and most documentary production gets completely wrong about who these people actually were. The image of the Bedouin that popular culture has produced is specific, persistent, and structurally false. Films portray desert nomads as endurance figures, people who survived through biological hardness and spiritual acceptance of suffering, who moved across the desert the way water moves downhill, following thirst and instinct, improvising shelter from whatever the landscape offered. The lone figure wrapped in cloth, the flickering fire, the empty horizon. The implicit argument is always the same. These people survived because the desert made them tough. This is not just inaccurate, it is the opposite of the truth. The historical record, not the cinematic record, the actual documented historical record, describes something radically different from improvised endurance. Al-Muqaddasi, the Arab geographer and scholar writing in 985 AD, documents the Trans-Arabian and Trans-Saharan trade network with the precision of a modern infrastructure survey. He catalogs rest stations spaced at intervals calculated specifically against camel endurance thresholds, not human preference. He notes water source depths, seasonal variance in subsurface availability, surface terrain conditions by month, and the specific meteorological windows during which different route segments were and were not passable. This is not travel writing. This is operational documentation of a managed logistics network. The caravan master carried meteorological knowledge that required years of structured apprenticeship to acquire. The behavioral signatures of the Sirocco and Compson winds at different points along the route. The early visual indicators of a sandstorm 48 hours before it arrives, specific ground temperature thresholds above which certain route segments became impassable regardless of water supply. His authority over every movement and resource decision was absolute, because the consequence of error was measured in human lives and cargo loss that could bankrupt a trading house. Charles Doughty, embedded with Bedouin groups in the Arabian Peninsula for nearly 2 years, documenting his observations in Travels in Arabia Deserta in 1888, admitted in print that what he expected to find was improvisation, and what he found instead was a system. He had prepared himself to document a primitive way of life. He ended up documenting an engineering culture that had solved problems his own civilization had not yet formulated. The Bedouins were not nomads hardened by suffering. They were the designers and operators of the most demanding precision logistics system in the pre-industrial world, one that moved hundreds of millions of dinars worth of cargo across the most hostile terrain on Earth, on schedule, for centuries, with a survival rate that no external organization ever matched. France, 35,000 soldiers. Their technological advantages for the era. Napoleonic tactical doctrine representing the most advanced infantry strategy in Europe. Field artillery that outranged any regional force by a factor of 2. And an engineering corps trained at the Cole Polytechnique, the finest technical institution in the Western world at the time. In the same desert landscape where Bedouin tribes had operated continuous trade and communication networks for 3,000 years without losing organized columns to heat. What happened to the French forces in Egypt is recorded in military dispatches and in the personal memoirs of Napoleon's senior officers with a specificity that reads as clinical testimony. By the second week of July 1798, with the column pushing inland from Alexandria toward Cairo in full summer heat, the army was disintegrating not from enemy action, but from the environment. French soldiers were marching in heavy wool uniforms designed for European campaigning, carrying packs weighing 40 pounds in direct sun at temperatures exceeding 42 C. They had no understanding of the behavioral protocols that made desert movement survivable. They marched when the sun was highest, because that was when European armies marched. They drank when they were thirsty, which meant they drank 2 hours after dehydration had already begun degrading their capacity for judgment and coordination. Dominique Jean Larrey, Napoleon's chief surgeon, traveling with the Egyptian campaign and documenting medical casualties in detail, recorded heat deaths in double figures per day during the inland advance. His field reports describe soldiers abandoning rifles, ammunition pouches, and artillery equipment along the march route, not from enemy pressure, but because the men carrying them had crossed physiological thresholds that made the weight unbearable. Equipment worth hundreds of livres per unit was left in the sand. At the crossing toward Cairo in August 1798, French forces sustained at least 400 heat casualties in a single sustained march. Not wounds, not disease, heat in one march. Henry Lawrence, the French historian whose 1997 study of the Egyptian campaign remains the definitive analysis, concludes that the central strategic failure of the expedition was not military but environmental. The French command applied European operational assumptions to a system that had no tolerance for European operational assumptions, and the desert extracted the cost with arithmetic precision. This is not legend. This is the historical record. The Bedouin courier network operating between Cairo and the desert interior during the same summer months of 1798 was moving messages and light cargo across 80 to 120-mile routes without the mortality and material losses the French experienced on 10-mile marches. Same desert, same season, same sun, different systems, different outcomes. The Bedouins did not survive the desert in spite of it. They survived because they understood thermal exchange, water metabolism, and human physiological limits with a precision that no engineering institution has fully replicated in the 2 centuries since industrialized civilization began trying. In 2003, the U.S. Department of Defense initiated the Integrated Thermal Management Research Program, working with MIT's Department of Architecture to develop passive cooling structures for forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, desert environments where electrical power for air conditioning was unreliable and where heat casualties were degrading operational effectiveness. The program produced modular shade and ventilation structures that achieved interior temperature reductions of 8 to 11 C under direct desert sun conditions. Cost per deployable unit, $18,000 to $45,000. Deployment time, 4 to 8 weeks of construction. Operational lifespan, 3 to 5 years before material degradation requires replacement. The Bed al-Shahar achieves 15 C of interior cooling. Cost, 4 people's labor and the annual fiber yield of a family herd. Deployment time, 40 minutes. Operational lifespan, decades with basic maintenance. It does not require a supply chain. It does not require a contractor. It does not require a budget line. The Bedouin robe system, validated by Tel Aviv University in 2020, still has no commercial or military equivalent that simultaneously achieves full body coverage, passive self-replenishment, and dual thermal function, cooling by day, insulating by night in a single garment with zero external inputs. The global military cooling equipment market generates approximately $340 million in annual revenue selling partial solutions to a problem that was solved completely in fiber and wool before the first Roman legion set foot on African soil. This is not nostalgia. This is thermodynamics. If what brought you here is the real history, not the version with stoic wanderers surviving on spiritual toughness, or the textbook reduction of desert civilization to camels and sand dunes, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe and you will see what comes next.